The Mudgee mail train was chugging along between Penrith and Glenbrook, west of Sydney, as it had done countless times before. The train had left Sydney at 10 p.m. and reached Penrith at 10:54 p.m, and Emu Plains at 11:03 p.m. It was the 8th of April, 1930, 11:05 p.m, and in the guard's van, relieving guard Alfred Ernest Squires and armed escort Kenneth Allen were probably feeling relaxed. Everything was routine. Until two masked men in their mid-20s or early 30s suddenly burst in with revolvers drawn on the two men. There was little time to react. Squires made a move but received a blow on the jaw for his trouble from one of the bandits. The second intruder pushed his gun against Allen's chest and said, "We're not bad. You make a move and I will shoot. And we'll shoot to kill." Allen and Squires were disarmed and ordered to one end of the van, where they were bound and gagged. Then the bandits searched the van for valuables, locating the bullion chest, which they broke open. Inside the chest was a fortnight's pay for all the staff on the Mudgee line, in the bullion box, which was made of tin and measured 12 by 16 inches, along with a leather bag containing silver coins. In all, £18,104 in notes, silver and cheques. In 2021, the haul would be worth $1.5 million Australian dollars. Keeping a watchful eye on the two railway officers, the men then waited until the train had travelled about a mile and was nearing the Glenbrook Tunnel in the Blue Mountains, about 2 miles from Emu Plains, and travelling at about 25 miles per hour due to the steep gradient. Here they warned their captives again. Then one man opened the door and leapt out. The box weighed about 150 pounds and the second man pushed it out, and then followed. The heist was all over in a few minutes. Somehow an alarm was raised, and the train was immediately stopped and a hurried search made, but no sign of the men could be seen. So the train continued to the next station, where police were notified. Police patrols were established along the Great Western Road to question all motorists. A Mr. Bray, who was helping police search by providing illumination with his car headlights, claimed he was shot at about 1 a.m. The bullet whistled over his head. A constable at Lapstone Hill also heard the shot. 2 men camping near Emu Plains were found to possess an unlicensed revolver and arrested, but police later discounted them as having anything to do with the robbery. Marks were found 200 yards on the Katoomba side of the Lapstone Viaduct, which were thought to be where the bullion box struck the ground. Nearby, a cut in the wire fence was discovered. Under a bush was a small oil can and 2 pieces of oil-stained rag, and on the road adjacent were fresh car tyre marks. The oil can and the spanner the bandits left behind in the van were taken for fingerprint analysis. It was quickly discovered the marks on the ground, tyre prints and the cut wire had nothing to do with the case. Police were informed that the afternoon before the robbery, 5 men in a blue touring car had pulled up beside the railway line. One of the men used a crutch to walk with. The 2 guards were interviewed at length and took part in a reenactment to try and ascertain where the box was pushed from the train on the 11th of April. It was considered too risky for police to emulate the leap made by the 2 bandits, even in daylight. An Aboriginal tracker was also engaged to look for any tracks left by the train robbers. It was considered amazing that neither bandit appeared to have been injured in the daring jump, as the country here was some of the wildest in the mountains. When no tracks could be found, it was speculated that somehow the men had remained on the train and disembarked unnoticed later. A police test with another box ended with the box shattering when it hit the ground. With investigations leading nowhere, a £500 reward was offered on the 16th of April. Squires and Allen, perhaps with suspicion of collusion hanging over them, were both summarily sacked on the 6th of June 1930. Squires had worked on the railways for 30 years, and Allen had been employed by them since he left high school. Squires was reinstated on the 9th of October. Allen revealed that police had tried to force him to confess to playing a part in the robbery. Finally, a clue in the case came on the 17th of July when a rusty padlock from the bullion box was found pressed 3/4 of an inch to gravel and soil on Lapstone Hill, about 2 miles from where the bandits left the train. But again, it led nowhere. Similarly, in November, when the bag from the robbery was found, it provided no help in finding the perpetrators. The bag had been cut open and the money removed, then filled with stones and thrown into a waterhole 20 yards off the road, 3.5 miles from Penrith. It was found by the farmer when his pond dried up in the warmer weather. The Mudgee Mail train robbery languished as an unsolved crime, when on the 30th of April 1931 the Canberra mail train was robbed. A bag containing wages for the post office in Canberra sent from Sydney on the express, when opened, was found to contain old phone books and some rubbish. Somebody had gotten away with £10,000, the equivalent of almost $1 million in 2021. The theft was done at Queanbeyan at 4 o'clock in the morning, when the money bag and other mails were taken from the Cuba train and placed on the platform for transfer to the Canberra Express at 5 a.m. Amazingly, the mail was left unguarded, and a man was able to stroll up with a dummy bag identical to that holding the cash, switch them, and walk away with the loot. The bag the money was in was found discarded in the Queanbeyan River on the 7th of May. It had been weighted down with stones and tossed from a bridge. A break in the new case was quick in coming. On the 6th of May, a jeweller named Solomon Cohen was walking in the dusk along Birrell Street to his home in York Street Centennial Park after a day at work, as he had done for the past 22 years. Suddenly a brown-coloured limousine pulled up and two men rushed at him, at a spot where a street lamp had been broken, one swinging a bottle wrapped in a handkerchief as a club. The victim was struck twice by one man, knocking off his hat and his horn-rimmed spectacles, and punched by the other, who also pulled Cohen's coat up over his face, then dragged to the waiting car where he was bound, blindfolded and gagged by a man with enormous hands. This third man found Cohen's keys in his pocket and passed them to four other men in a car, who immediately drove to Sydney. Cohen's shop, called Russell's Jewellers, was in King Street, where he had conducted business for 30 years. The robbers had rehearsed their plan beforehand, carrying out the actions of kidnapping a man, taking his keys and going to the shop. There they observed the police constable on the beat and timed his movements and how long it would take to enter the shop and take what they wanted. Now they effected that plan while Constable White was furthermost from the shop. Two men entered, went straight to a safe, and picked out the most expensive uncut diamonds and diamond jewellery they found. It was estimated by insurers that the haul was worth £3,500. The thieves did not take any rubies or opals. Two charwomen from an adjoining hotel were at the back of the shop talking, and through a window could see the men sorting through the jewels, but their appearance and demeanour fooled the women into thinking they were employees working late. Within a few minutes they had pulled the door to and locked the grille and driven back to Centennial Park. The other car had driven around for 25 minutes. Any time Cohen moved he was punched and warned that if he squealed they would kill him. Cohen, still tied up, was unceremoniously thrown among rubbish in a gutter and given a kick goodbye near Queen's Park, and both cars drove away fast in different directions with headlights off. A council employee saw a tall man exit the limousine and put his hand in the smaller car which had driven up, but in the gloom assumed it was something to do with sly grog and ignored it. A passing motorist saw Cohen's plight and rescued him and drove him home, where his wife was frantic. Cohen always arrived home at 6:30 p.m, plus or minus a minute or two. She had phoned the shop at 7 p.m, and when she got no answer, phoned the fruiterer next door. He alerted the constable, who had by this time reached the area. The policeman, who had seen Cohen leave and wished him a good night earlier, climbed the grille and, finding the door not quite shut, entered the shop to discover gemstones, bangles, and watches littering the floor. Cohen was confident that one of the men spoke with a Woolloomooloo accent. A reward of £500 was quickly approved to solve the case. On May the 10th, an extraordinary event occurred. The Cohens were home in the evening with two friends when they received a phone call. Disguising his voice, a man said, "If you look outside your back gate, you will find the papers that were taken from the safe." Mrs. Cohen asked, "Why do you tell me this when you can get a reward if you take the information to the police?" "I do not want to have anything to do with the police," was the answer. "I suppose that you're one of the robbers," accused Mrs. Cohen. "I could have been, but I didn't want to join them," the caller replied, and hung up. The two friends went outside, and laying on the ground in a brown paper parcel found insurance papers, property deeds, and the wedding certificates of the Cohens and their daughter. Police began questioning likely suspects. On the 7th of May, a 35-year-old salesman named Arthur Collins was being questioned when £61 of the money from the Canberra mail robbery and a small deposit box key were found among his possessions. Working on a hunch, the money and key were unremarked on and returned to the man, who was then shadowed. The number of the key was used to trace it to a branch of the Commonwealth Bank. The box was inspected, and not only the diamonds but money from the mail robbery found, which was left in place. While being watched, Collins was seen to visit Joe Ryan at Paddington and borrow his car before driving to the bank to take £200 from the box. He was also seen frequently meeting and speaking to another man, who was also placed under surveillance. In turn, this man was seen often in the company of a man who drove a dilapidated lorry. The lorry driver was career criminal Percy Jacobs. This man led them to a fourth man who was living in a hut near Penrith. This man was named George Morris. He was seen to walk off rapidly across a paddock, but was lost in the darkness. The next morning, police followed his tracks in the frosty grass, which led to a large tree. The ground near the base of the tree had been disturbed, so police obtained shovels and dug at the spot. They unearthed a kit bag inside a Hessian bag. Inside the bag was £7,600 in notes. Meanwhile, Jacobs, the lorry driver, had been lost by police, but was thought to have been headed for Melbourne. On the 12th of May, 2 arrests were made at gunpoint. Collins and a 30-year-old labourer named James Caffrey were charged with assaulting Cohen and the theft from the shop. Morris was arrested the same day as the money was dug up in the paddock on his farm and taken to Sydney CIB. At the behest of police, Morris visited Ryan on the 16th of May. On the 18th of May, Joseph Ryan was arrested at his Paddington home. £100 of the Canberra mail money was found hidden behind a wardrobe mirror. On the same day, Collins and Caffrey were further charged with the Canberra mail robbery. £7,900 of the stolen money had been recovered. On the 9th of June, Lancelot Lynch, a 31-year-old postal assistant, Arthur Collins and Joseph Ryan were charged with having stolen the money from the Canberra Express. James Caffrey was charged with receiving £200, knowing it to be stolen, but police tendered no evidence and he was discharged. The robbery had its genesis in a suggestion by Lancelot Lynch to Percy Jacobs about stealing from the Lismore mail. The two men had gone to the wharf to see how the mail was handled, but they decided that wouldn't be a good target for robbery. Soon after, Jacobs and Ryan went on a trip to Queanbeyan and Canberra to observe how the mail was handled. Lynch said he could provide a duplicate mailbag. As police searched for more evidence in the Canberra case, they discovered that Ryan had 4 bank accounts, all with over £1,000 in each. Deposits had been made in the past year. Police arrived at Iris Street, Paddington, armed with picks and shovels on the 22nd of June, and began digging up Ryan's yard. Eventually, after several hours, they found a nickel-plated revolver of the type issued to railguards, which was identified as the one which had been stolen from Kenneth Allen on the Mudgee train. Ryan, who was out on bail for the other robberies, was arrested on the evening of the 22nd of June, along with railway porter Roy Edward Wilkinson. Wilkinson had often acted as an escort for the bullion, but wasn't working the night the train was robbed. They were put in a lineup, but the 2 guards failed to identify them, instead pointing out an innocent man. On the 24th of June 1931, Ryan and 34-year-old Wilkinson were charged with the Mudgee train robbery. Arthur Collins pled guilty on the 17th of July to concealment of theft, and that he knew about the £10,000 which had been stolen, and agreed to keep quiet about it for the sum of £200. Collins and Caffrey pleaded guilty to receiving in the Solomon Cohen robbery case in November 1931. On the 11th of that month, Caffrey was sentenced to 12 months' imprisonment, but Collins feared better on account of the help he had given the police in the train robbery investigations. Collins' war record from World War I was mentioned, on what proved fortuitously for him to be the 13th anniversary of Armistice Day. Collins had won the military medal during the war. He was ordered to leave the state by the 1st of January 1932 and remain away for at least 3 years. Judge Armstrong reminded him that Collins would be putting himself at risk of very serious personal danger if he stayed in New South Wales. Meanwhile, Joe Ryan had signed over his car to his mother and secretly purchased a new car that police knew nothing about. Ryan was last seen on the 20th of July, and in August 1931 failed to appear in court. Despite a search that eventually spread worldwide, he had vanished completely. A description said he was of medium build with a sallow complexion. He was missing the tip of his left middle finger and walked slightly pigeon-toed, although with a firm, easy tread. He drove a blue Studebaker at the time and frequented hotels and billiard halls. Roy Wilkinson, who it is said suggested the crime to Ryan, was convicted of being an accessory and receiving, and in November 1931 was sentenced to 3 years jail with hard labour. Time passed, and out of the blue on the 17th of June 1935, police received a letter with unexpected tidings. It was from Joe Ryan, and he promised to surrender and face trial. In the epistle he explained he had left suddenly 4 years before, as he was short of funds for an adequate legal defence, and that a vital witness had disappeared. He would meet his solicitor and a member of the force he had known for 16 years at the barrister's chambers at 7 p.m. on the 19th of June. Rather dubiously, Inspector Quinn, who had been recalled from holidays, waited with the lawyer for Ryan. On the stroke of 7 by the town hall clock, a taxi pulled up, and Ryan, clad in a leather overcoat, stepped out and shook hands with both men. After making a statement, he and Quinn caught a tram to the Central Police Station, where Ryan was formally charged and given a cell for the night. He did not go into details of what he had been doing since 1931, but it's thought he was in England, and that he took part in at least one big gold robbery during that time. Ryan's much-delayed trial for the Canberra Express robbery began on the 29th of July 1935. It was alleged he was the man who had switched the bags on the platform at Queanbeyan Station, and had then driven 170 miles to Jamestown, where George Morris was the postmaster. £7,600 of the money was buried in Morris's fowl yard. This money was later dug up by the police, and Morris convinced to give evidence against Ryan. Percy Jacobs gave evidence that he had met Lancelot Lynch around February 1931 at the Edgecliff Telephone Exchange. In March he communicated with Ryan that a railways employee believed it would be an easy job to rob the Canberra mailbag. Ryan and Jacobs met Lynch, and Lynch said he had a mate who could mark the bag carrying the cash. Ryan and Jacobs went to Queanbeyan and checked how the trains operated. Ryan observed it would be a simple matter to lob the bag over the fence rather than carry it through the station. They then continued to Canberra and watched the mail being unloaded. Satisfied with what they had seen, they boarded the train for the return trip to Sydney. The main evidence against Ryan was the word of Morris and Jacobs. Ryan's lawyer, Mr. Curtis, said of Morris's visit that he may as well have played radio announcer and said, "Station CIB calling. Uncle George speaking. Look behind the lowboy and you will find a present," putting the idea in the mind of the jury that the money from the robbery found at Ryan's could have been planted. Ryan seemed unruffled throughout the 4-day hearing. The jury deliberated for 4 hours, and Ryan was just as unmoved when they declared him not guilty. Several women in the public gallery, however, shouted in delight. The prosecutor admitted that Jacobs and Morris were men of mud and wretches, but added they were just the type of man employed by a mastermind when carrying out a criminal enterprise. He then added that in Ryan was just such a mastermind. Jacobs, whose real name was Crawshaw, was not charged for this crime, but the Queenslander had a long record and was jailed for another theft not long after. Ryan was exonerated from the Canberra caper, but still remanded in custody for the Mudgee robbery, to be addressed the following month. This trial was scheduled to commence in September, but delays pushed it back to October. Finally, on the 8th of October, the trial for the Mudgee robbery began. It was alleged that Ryan and Arthur Collins were the two men who boarded the train, and that Ryan assaulted Squires. Morris waited for the train to come into view from his vantage point, and then began flashing a torch on and off as a signal. When the money was thrown out, Morris was waiting to collect it and drive it away to his farm. Occasionally, Morris would retrieve some of the money and take it to Collins' flat in Darlinghurst. The notes would then be exchanged for larger denominations. Morris and Collins turned King's evidence, agreeing to testify against Ryan on the condition that they were not charged for their part in the affair. Morris claimed that Ryan had blackmailed him into taking part through his knowledge of a conviction for dishonesty in Victoria in the 1920s. If it became known, Morris would lose his position as postmaster of Jamestown. Collins proved difficult in the witness box, claiming his memory had failed on much of what had occurred 4 years earlier, although he didn't contradict anything he had said back then either. The two train guards repeated the story of the events of that night, but admitted they could not identify either of the robbers. After Morris and Collins had spoken about the robbery, Ryan declared he was absolutely innocent, and that the other two were trying to foist off their crime onto him. Morris and his crowd were liars, he said. They lied at Lynch's trial and would have jailed an innocent man. Ryan swore he had never met Lynch before he was arrested. Ryan declared he was not near Penrith the night of the robbery, but in Sydney. Ryan said he had 2 large wins gambling on horse racing in 1930, and that Morris knew about that, and used it to frame him. Several bookmakers backed up Ryan's story, one saying he had transacted with him since 1927, and that Ryan would sometimes bet big and win big. Joseph Thompson, a draper, and James Clark, a taxi driver, both testified they were with Ryan on the afternoon and evening of the robbery. They attended a funeral and remained together until 10:30 p.m. Thompson said he had known Ryan for 15 years, while Clark said he and Ryan had been mates for 10 years. Ryan's counsel remarked to the jury that although they were entitled to convict on the word of accomplices, it was dangerous to do so. He said the 2 men on the train were Collins and Morris. Before the jury began deliberations, they were taken to inspect the scene of the robbery on the 14th of October. After so much delay, following 12 hours of discussion, the jury returned to admit they could not reach a decision. The case was therefore scheduled to be reheard at the next sessions. The second trial began on the 28th of November. Significantly this time Squires said he didn't think Ryan looked like the man who had assaulted him on the train, and Arthur Collins had made himself scarce. Police were unable to locate him to give evidence again. With the case having fallen apart, Ryan was rapidly acquitted of the Mudgee train robbery on the 2nd of December 1935. Following his acquittal, Ryan managed to keep a low profile for most of the next decade. The next big attempted train robbery in New South Wales took place on the 8th of December 1941. This time it was an attempt to rob a pay bus, a small 4-wheeled railway car taking money to railway employees in the country. These ran to a regular timetable and were used from 1919 up until 1986, when made obsolete by electronic banking. They were slow, only capable of 10 to 12 miles per hour. Pay bus number 5 left the Clyde workshop at 8 a.m. to travel along the Goulburn line. £11,232 16 shillings and 5 pence was in the iron safe, welded to the chassis of the little train when they left. There were 3 men aboard: a driver, 50-year-old George Randall, the paymaster, Frederick Walker, aged 54, and an escort, Alfred Philpott, aged 52. Each man was armed with a revolver. The train stopped at Campbelltown and Picton and paid railway workers, then proceeded towards its next stop. As it travelled, the paymaster and escort counted out about £2,500 in preparation. All was well until 11:40 a.m, when the train reached a spot near Yandera, a small town on the Hume Highway. There train robbers had set a deadly ambush. Explosives, believed to be gelignite, had been placed in 2 water pipes and pushed under the tracks. Wires cut from a fence led to the bombs from an area about 30 metres away, where the robbers lay concealed in long grass. As the train reached the spot near a tunnel, they detonated the bombs with an electric battery. It is thought they had intended to blow up the rails in front of the train to stop it, but instead the explosion occurred underneath the front wheels. The massive blast propelled the train 30 metres along the track, where it toppled off the rails and slid down a 60-foot embankment. Railway sleepers were splintered by the force of the bomb. As the 3 railwaymen lay mortally injured, the robbers grabbed up what notes they could from the chaos and fled. Their haul would have been less than £1,200. Notes and coins were left strewn along the tracks. 2 men wearing dark shirts and khaki shorts were seen running off into the bush by the driver of a goods train which pulled up at the scene minutes after the explosion. He saw one of them stumble and expected he would have suffered abrasions. The driver and the guard were killed outright, the driver being flung from the train and found dead 15 metres away, with one leg torn off. The other 2 were trapped in the tangled remains of the train, and oxyacetylene equipment was called in to cut them free. Unfortunately, it was unable to be used due to the danger of igniting spilled petrol. The paymaster was freed, but the guard died before a doctor could arrive from Mittagong. The paymaster was taken to Mittagong Hospital with severe head and shoulder injuries and compound fractures of both legs. He died early the following morning, making the bombing a triple homicide. A squad of 40 police combed the bush and interviewed residents in a triangle between Berrima, Mittagong and Moss Vale, desperate for any clue. A pick and shovel, some tape and a piece of newspaper distributed locally on the 1st of December, and parts of the bomb were recovered. From small pieces of coal on cotton on the detonator, it was thought to have been taken from a coal mine. But with little forthcoming, a reward of £1,500 was posted on the 16th of December. 2 steel discs badly pitted by the explosion found by the tracks could not be identified as railway property, and were thought that these had covered the bombs. 1943 passed into 1944, and no arrests were made. In January, police requested that whoever had written a letter to them on the 5th of January with information get back in touch with them, but whether they did or if their information was unimportant is unknown. At the inquest held on the 13th of October 1942, the goods train driver, John Gersbach, said one of the men he saw fleeing was heavily suntanned and looked to be what he called a foreigner. The man was 5'9" and of medium build. Both men had a lot of hair and seemed to be about the same age. It was revealed a troop train had passed over the spot 20 minutes earlier, and that the bomb must already have been in place. There was no evidence that it had been intended to be an act of military sabotage. The district coroner returned a finding of murder against person or persons unknown. In 1948, some articles such as a canvas coin bag, rubber bands of a type used to hold banknotes, and some electrical wire, thought to have been connected with the robbery, were found in a cave near Dingo Creek, which appeared to have been placed there as a joke only a few days earlier. Police dismissed them as a hoax. Did Ryan have anything to do with Yanderra? Somebody on the 30th of January 1931 placed a pinch bar across the rails at Katoomba to derail the Mudgee train, the same one he and his gang had been accused of robbing in 1930. The bar was chosen instead of bulkier items nearby because it was low enough that the lifeguard in front of the train would not push the obstruction away. At 2:20 a.m, it was not noticeable even in the moonlight when the train struck it, but failed to derail. The bar had not been there 30 minutes earlier when another train passed by. Another attempt was made using a fish plate placed on the rails on the 7th of February near Blackheath, but the obstacle was spotted by the driver, who stopped in time to avoid it. Police believed that a convicted murderer named Lionel Thomas may have been guilty of the Yanderra bomb, but he committed suicide by hanging himself in Long Bay Jail on the 11th of September 1951. He was never charged with the bombing. Nobody was ever charged for the Yanderra train bombing, and it was all but forgotten, except by the family and friends of Randall, Philpott and Walker. Yet the events at Yanderra may have claimed another victim in 1944.